Hey everyone, welcome back to The Leadership Project with your host Mick Spears. Our vision is to inspire all leaders to challenge the status quo. We bring you weekly topics and thought-provoking guests to get you to stop, reflect, and think about what it means to be a leader in a modern world. Our aim is to help you become the leader you wish you always had, as we learn together and lead together. Today's episode is brought to you by my new book, You're a Leader, Now What? The Proven Path to High-Performance Leadership. The book contains many of the great lessons that we've been learning together during the Leadership Project podcast, together with many other lessons that I've collected over my 30-year career as a leader. The book is aimed at first-time leaders, but really there's lessons in there for everyone. It would be greatly appreciated if you could go and grab your copy on Amazon as either an ebook or a paperback, and if you could leave us an honest review on Amazon. Now, on with the show. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Project. I'm greatly honored today to be joined by David Shriner-Cahn. David is a community builder and a podcaster, and he's the host of two podcasts, the Smashing the Plateau podcast, which we'll talk about quite a bit today, and Going Solo. He's a consultant that helps other consultants and coaches and entrepreneurs to be able to establish themselves in the world, and particularly if they've been through some kind of transition from a corporate career or at the end of some kind of career where they've worked for other people and then decided to go it themselves. And that word community is really important because what he has established in Smashing the Plateau is a community that gives people a network of support around them when they do go through some of those life transitions. But before we get into too much of that, David, I would love it if you would introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a bit about your rich background and what led you to be with us today.
Thanks, Mick. Thank you so much for inviting me. So my background is like the folks we now help in the Smashing the Plateau community. I was an employee for the first 28 years of my career. Most of the time I was in management and leadership roles. And then I left employment and started my own solo consulting business in 2006. So that's now 16 years ago. And as a consultant, I have been primarily solo. And in addition to that, as you mentioned, I started a podcast in 2014. So I've been podcasting for a while. And it's an interview-based show like yours. So I have had conversations every week with some fantastic leaders and other people in business, and including some that are actually not in business now that I think about it. And then we launched a community to help consultants build their business. And one of the things that I found when I made the transition myself is that you go from, especially if you're in a leadership role, you go from a position where your inbox is overflowing and your calendar is full, and you have this built-in social structure, to going out and working on your own, and suddenly the social structure is gone. You're spending all this time alone. And in the beginning, your inbox is empty and your calendar is empty. And it's a really daunting feeling. And then you have to get up and sell something that you've never sold before, which is yourself. It's really hard. Your ego takes a hit when you leave that kind of corporate cocoon. And your self-confidence, when you've never had to sell yourself before and you're doing this and you don't have that kind of social support, your self-confidence can often be really poor. It impacts your ability to sell. It impacts your ability to be profitable. It impacts your ability to charge high prices. So it's really detrimental to try to do this totally on your own. And when you think about it, companies have all these support systems in place, which is why they're successful. And so as a solo entrepreneur, you should have the same kinds of support systems in place. And nowadays, you can do it really easily without investing a lot of time or money. That's kind of the beauty of the way technology and globalization has made it easier for people to go out on their own and have their own business. But at the same time, it's really important to have support. So I've kind of become really dedicated to this mission of helping folks go through this transition and do it as successfully as possible.
That's really good, David. And I'd like to unpack that a little bit more. I'd like to know about your own journey. So when you spoke about your 28-year career and then you went solo, did you experience those same emotions, that issue with self-confidence, or what was your own journey like when you made that transition?
So in my case, I did experience some self-confidence issues and other kinds of negative emotional reactions that I think were detrimental to my own progress. And frankly, there were some things that happened that maybe were just fortuitous that helped my business grow fairly quickly. Keep in mind, 2006, the economy was really strong worldwide and in the US. So that certainly helped. I think if I had gone solo 3 or 4 years later, things might have been quite different. But, in my case, I had been in the same job 18 years when I left, which is a long time. And the organization that I worked for grown and I would say innovated and evolved pretty successfully over those 18 years. In my case, there was a new CEO. I reported to the CEO. I was a vice president. There was a new CEO that came in a year before I left. And when the new CEO was announced, who was somebody I knew and liked and got along with well, I saw that there was some overlap of skills that I didn't have with the previous CEO. And even though we got along, we worked well together, and there was a need for the skills that I had, I suspected that it was a matter of time before there may not have been enough room in the organization for both of us. And it was pretty clear which one of us was going to be asked to leave. So I kind of saw the handwriting on the wall a year before it happened. And in my case, the linear career move and what most people would consider the safe career move would have been to go to another similar organization, either one that was larger size in the same role, or maybe similar size or smaller size where I would be the CEO. And those kinds of positions existed. I could certainly have tried to get one of those. But I, like many people that choose the entrepreneurial route, I wanted more control over my destiny. And even though as an executive, I had a lot of autonomy, I still had a boss. And I really wanted just to be the boss and not have a boss. So for me, it seemed pretty natural that my next step was going to be starting a consulting business. At that point in my career, I knew, unlike earlier in my career, I came from a family of parents that were very risk averse. They were employees. And the idea of leaving employment and starting a business when you're in your 50s was kind of anathema to them. And I didn't know a lot of entrepreneurs growing up. But particularly in the nonprofit sector, most of the board members were entrepreneurs. And in the last organization I was with, it was a national organization, and there were some very successful entrepreneurs that had started and or ran what were major corporations. So I saw firsthand how a lot of that worked. And of course, I was helping to run the organizations I worked for. Plus, I had hired lots of consultants and had friends that were consultants. So to me, it didn't seem all that daunting. It just seemed like I was going to do the same kind of work with the same kinds of organizations where I was an employee, and just do it on an independent consulting basis rather than an employee basis. And instead of having one client who was my employer, I would have multiple clients. So that was kind of what I saw. The reality is, when I left my job, I mentioned that it looked likely that there was going to be an involuntary exit. Yes, in fact, there was an involuntary exit. So I planned what I wanted to do. I didn't plan the exact timing. When the timing happened, even though I had expected this for a year, the day that it happened, I was actually quite shocked. And I was a bit traumatized by the whole thing. And the interesting thing is, I told almost no one that I had been fired, because there is a lot of shame in our culture around being fired.
Yeah.
even if it's like in my case, not for performance reasons. I mean, they were very clear that this was a redundancy. They thought highly of me. They were trying to help me move on. And so it wasn't an issue of performance, yet still, I told very few people that there was an involuntary exit. I made it sound like I was doing this voluntarily, and this was a proactive career move. Now, the reality is, I really did want to start my own business. So what I did next was very proactive, but the actual trigger was not my choice. And that had a negative impact on me emotionally. A lot of comments from people that were close to me, things like, David, what are you going to do for health insurance? Which, in most of the developed world, health insurance is taken care of by the government. In the US, it's not. It's tied to employment. But I said, I'll buy health insurance just like any other employer does. But people who are of an employee mindset, who don't know how these kinds of structures work, think that it's a very risky move to go from being an employee to being an entrepreneur. Yeah, so emotionally, it was quite challenging. And I didn't have any business. I didn't, even though I knew what the kind of work I wanted to do, I had no clients lined up. I had no business plan. I had no idea how I was going to market and sell myself. The reality is, like most consultants, my business early on came from direct referrals from my network. And I had some really good clients within the first couple of years that came kind of naturally with no marketing whatsoever, other than when I happened to be in a situation with colleagues, I would talk about what I was doing. And there were a couple of occasions where people referred business to me. I did a little bit of intentional networking, but very little. So as I said, I was lucky that things got off the ground fairly quickly with good client work. And I knew, since I had a finance and operations background, P&L side of the business was no issue whatsoever for me. I know there are many consultants, numbers part of the business ends up being really hard for them. That wasn't my case, but certainly like branding, positioning, marketing, I was totally clueless. And that I had to learn the hard way.
Yeah, there's many things there I want to explore a little bit further, David, if I can. The first one I want to talk about is the trauma and the ego. So even though you saw the writing on the wall, it still came as a shock to you. And you're right, there's a stigma around being involuntary let go, that people maybe do not stick up their hand and admit that too readily, that's for sure. Can I ask, you said that you then got stimulated into an action. Was that immediate, or was there a period of time where you kind of, I'm going to use your word, plateaued or went into a hole for a while? How did you get from the trauma and the ego hit to fully up on your feet and running? How did that happen?
I'm an action-focused person and I'm a planner. So I will fill my time pretty effectively with activity that I think is going to move the needle. And even though trying to do this totally on your own without the social structure can be hard, I'm pretty good at being sufficiently motivated that I'm not going to waste time. One other thing was going on in my life that did provide a lot of social support, which is, at the time that this happened, I was a volunteer leader for an educational event. This is an event it's an educational retreat that is run entirely by volunteers. Well, almost entirely. There was one paid staff person, but everybody else was volunteer. There was this huge volunteer structure. And I had been involved in this organization for a few years before the time when I was let go. The year that I was let go, I was co-chairing the conference. And by co-chairing the conference, what it means is you are essentially responsible for managing a team of about 100 volunteers who spend 10 months planning this event. And it's probably like a half-time job. It really takes a lot of hours to do that. So there were meetings, like multiple meetings per week. There was, multiple communications with the various teams that were responsible for this. So there was like this major ongoing activity that certainly I had more time to actually work on than I did as a volunteer when I had a job. So I kind of had that built-in social structure. And since it was in the same field that I was working in, I was interacting with a lot of the same people that I needed to interact with for my consulting business. So I had, in a sense, even though the community wasn't focused on building a business, I did have a community that had some relationship with the kind of work I was looking to do, which made it a lot easier.
what I'm taking from that, and I want to paraphrase it, and you tell me if I go on a tangent here, but I'm hearing someone that kept themselves busy, kept themselves active in the service of others through volunteer work that was also focused on things that would, in your words, move the needle. So there were things that you didn't just sit around the house and feel sorry for yourself and go, oh my God, I've been let go and all of these things. You got off on your feet and you kept yourself busy, but you also kept yourself focused is what I'm hearing there.
Yes, very much so.
Okay. The other thing I heard, David, when you were doing that description is you saw the writing was on the wall. For people that are out, there's a great resignation going on. There's a lot of people voluntarily leaving businesses at the moment and then making decisions. Am I going to go into another corporate gig? Am I going to be an entrepreneur? All these kind of things. For you, you kind of saw the writing was on the wall about a year out. Did you start really planning the business at that point, or was it just a glimmer in your eye? What was it?
I knew what I wanted to do next. I didn't know how.
Okay.
I just knew the what.
All right. So where I want to go with that decision, do you have any advice out there? And it could be voluntary or involuntary for those people that are at those forks in the road in their career where they're deciding, do I jump from, and for some of them, it's a toxic culture, by the way. They're jumping from a toxic culture and they're worried about whether they're jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire, right? So do I jump into another company only to find out that that's also a toxic culture? In other cases, it's just they're a bit tired and exhausted. Everyone has their different reasons for why they're voluntarily leaving. And then there's the involuntary side as well. When you made that decision, okay, do I go and become a CEO of another sized company, or do I go on my own? What advice do you have to people out there that are making those fork in the road decisions today?
It depends somewhat on your financial circumstances. If you have the financial capacity to spend some time not focused on producing income, that is great, because what you really need to do in that interim period is some deep self-reflection. You actually need some space from the trauma, whether it's a toxic workplace, or maybe it's not so toxic, but you have just been burning the candle at both ends for months or maybe years, and you just haven't had the space to really think about what's important to you in your life. It takes time to kind of unwind from that rat race or that, the hamster wheel that you've been on. And if there's a toxic culture or there's any kind of trauma connected with your work or your exit, you need space to actually, to reflect on what's going on, reflect on what's important to you. Ideally, what I think most people need is, like, especially if they've been like me in their work environment for decades, I think you need 6 to 12 months. I would say you need at least 3 to deal with this. So can you get by without focusing on producing income for 6 to 12 months? Some people can, and some people can't. And if you can, there's a lot of pressure in our culture to be busy doing something that sounds good in terms of your self-identity and your ego. Mm. And so there's a lot of pressure to be in another job or to have certain kinds of clients right away. And I think there's nothing wrong with taking a sabbatical. And I use the word sabbatical intentionally. As you described in the introduction, I've had these podcasts and I've interviewed many people who have gone through these transitions. And most people describe a period of self-reflection where they're not earning income as time off. I think time off is often viewed with a negative connotation. And a sabbatical generally is viewed with a positive connotation. Mm. So I like to use the word sabbatical to describe this period of self-reflection. I think it's really important. Now, if you don't have the financial wherewithal to be able to do that, you could do some other things, such as you could take a job that is going to be interim, and you're really clear with the person or the organization that hires you that it is interim, that you're not intending it to be a long-lasting career move, because that sets you up with a different set of expectations on both sides. You could actually look for a contract job where you know that it's time limited. You could do some consulting work that may not be the kind of work that you think is going to fit your long-term goals, but just may provide some income and some stopgap. And it could even be in a field that's quite different than what you've been working in, but just to provide a little bit of income so that you can maintain your lifestyle and not feel threatened that the lack of income is going to derail things. But again, it's important to look at it as being temporary, because once you think about it as being permanent, it puts a whole different color on it, and it will put a different kind of pressure on you, and you won't have the mental space to do the self-reflection.
Yeah, good, David. So don't invest yourself too much in that. You give value to that client, whoever you're consulting to, but remember it's a stopgap, and it's putting food on the table and the roof over the head whilst your mind space is working on what actually you're drawn towards.
Like in college, you might take a job working in a grocery store to provide a little bit of pocket money. There are work-study programs in school. You might work in the library or work in the bookstore just to pay some bills, but that is not something that you want to do as your career. So this is the same thing. And just, you want to look for something that's going to be as low stress as possible, as high income as possible for the amount of time you have to put in. And again, just think about it as it being time limited.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I like that college job analogy. That's a perfect example, because you're there on college to work on yourself for your future. And if you're waiting tables at the local restaurant, that is a means to an end, right? So yeah, really good. Nice analogy. Now, it's also true, David, that not all entrepreneurs make it. A lot of people have big, bright ideas, but then they find out somewhere along the journey that entrepreneurship is either not for them, or they just fail to some degree. How does someone that's at that fork in the road test themselves in some way to know, have I truly got what it takes to be an entrepreneur, before they invest their time, money, and effort into going down that path?
Mick, it depends somewhat on your tolerance for risk. People that make good entrepreneurs tend to be a little more comfortable with risk. The reality is, again, this is my opinion, but the reality is that paycheck from a single income source, if that is your only source of income, is way riskier than having a business where you have multiple sources of revenue. It's different because when you leave a job, if that job is your only source of income, your income goes from 100% to zero overnight. And the minute you walk into another job, your income goes from 0 to 100% overnight. It never happens when you're an entrepreneur. If you leave a job and then you become an entrepreneur, your income will go from 100% to 0. And then if your business is building successfully, it will slowly creep up. It could take as long as several years, especially as a consultant, to match your compensation that you had in your job. So if you want to test yourself to be an entrepreneur, I mean, there are things that you could do while you're still employed. One of the most important things is to sell. If you don't sell, you have no business, right? So you could practice selling some things and maybe, pick something that is not, doesn't have a lot of emotional baggage to you. Pick something that you think is not so connected to your career and see if you could make some steady income selling it. That's one way to test. Another way is you could do some market research. I know one of the most important things when you're starting a business, whether it's a consulting business or any other kind of business, is you need to know whether what you think people will buy, they will actually buy. And one way to do that is to do some market research. A lot of consultants have never done market research before, and they find it really daunting to talk to total strangers about hypothetically whether they would buy something that the consultant is thinking of selling. So you could do some market research and create a hypothesis about a particular market. Again, it doesn't have to be something that you're going to make a career selling as a consultant. Pick something that's a hobby, potentially a way to create some business income around the hobby, and do a little market research. See how that feels. You could try writing some positioning statements on what you think a value proposition may be for a new business, and then sit down with some people who There's some who know you, maybe some who don't know you, and get their reaction to the value proposition. I mean, these are all exercises that we need to go through as entrepreneurs. Many people find them really daunting the first time they do them. Those are things you could do pretty easily in practice, even while you're employed.
There's 3 really important messages there, David, I'd like to talk about. I'd like to add something around the market research. For those that are out there thinking about doing exactly what David's saying, make sure that that market research is actually with your target audience, right? We're not talking about going and asking your friends and family, because they could go one of 2 ways. They could pour cold water on a really good idea because they're risk averse themselves, or they might go, oh yeah, that sounds amazing, but they're never the person that's going to write a check and pay for your services. So when you do that market research, make sure it is the target audience of someone that would actually pay for the service in the first place, and deeply listen to them. What are their needs and what is the gap that you might be able to help fill for them? On the purpose statement, stuff that you spoke about, David, if you can't, with absolute clarity, explain to someone, let's say you meet them at an art gallery opening or a coffee shop or a dinner party, if you can't, with deep clarity, be able to explain to someone what it is you do, who you serve, and what problem you help them solve, it's going to be very difficult for you to sell it to anyone in the future. So that purpose statement point was really key. And then on the selling, you do need to test yourself, because all entrepreneurs sell. And if you can't sell, or it's something that you don't feel comfortable with, you need to get comfortable with it. You need to build up that skill, or you're going to need to employ someone very darn quickly to help you with that selling. But most entrepreneurs do a big percentage of selling themselves. So that's a really good test, David. I want to come back to the support structures now. Two factors. I want to start with I'm going to say the physical support here. It's not the right word, but it'll do for now. You were a VP in a company. You had a big team around you. You had people in finance. You had people in marketing. You had people in all different departments in your team. Then you go solo, and entrepreneurs, when they start, particularly solopreneurs, they're everything from janitor to CEO. Tell us about that journey. How did you transition from, well, I've got this team that do everything for me, so to speak, to now I've got to do everything from go to woe?
So I did go through that. And one of the benefits maybe was the fact that I worked in the nonprofit sector, where we're used to doing a lot with a smaller set of support structures than you will typically find in the corporate arena. So the fact that I had to do most things myself was a little less daunting, but I was pretty clear early on that there's certain things that I just don't have the skill set to do and or don't have the interest in doing. So for example, when it came time to create the first website, I hired somebody. Today, maybe it's easier. There are a lot of self-designed websites that you can purchase I'm trying to think when I created the first website. It was probably around 2007 or so. That those tools weren't really available, but you don't have to invest a lot of money in any of these things. So I hired someone who was a student and a family friend who was grateful to get the work and was really good, knew how to do it. And so I had a nice website up pretty quickly. Was it the kind of website that my business has now? No, but it was enough to get started. And, that's true with most things. You don't have to spend a ton of money to get started. It's more important to get started than to do nothing. So if there's something that your business really needs, look for some inexpensive resources to solve the problem. And by the way, this is another place where being part of a community of entrepreneurs can be really helpful, because then you can ask people in the community, who can I go to for a very basic website that doesn't need to be great. It just needs to be a start.
Yeah, very good, David. So the 3 things I heard there. So there is a season where most solopreneurs do pretty much everything. There's a season for that. But then what I was picking up was 2 things. One was the self-awareness. So you need to come to that self-awareness of, okay, what is it that I'm good at? What is it that is not my strong point? And what can I outsource that would then help me with that weak point so I can focus on what I'm good at? And then the takeoff from that is that's how you can end up scaling your new business. So if you stay in solopreneur forever, you'll not get to the growth that you probably have in mind. So that's when you need that infrastructure. So in David's example, he's a student building the website for him, that gives him time back where he can go out and start selling, for example, right? So it's also about scaling.
By the way, when I started my first blog, I saw that consultants that I thought were more successful than me had content that was out there. And I thought it was important to start a blog. And I didn't know how to do it. And I could have spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. Instead, I hired a student who was a good writer and had already created his own blog. He knew the back end of the website, how to actually do it.
Yeah.
And he could write posts. So
great example.
It was a no-brainer. It was not a huge investment. And not only did we get a blog up fairly quickly, we were able to produce consistent content because I had a team. Again, this is like a fractional person team, but a team member who was dedicated to just producing content every single week. So we had content every week on the blog site from day one.
A great example. Thank you, David. Now I want to get to that emotional support. So you go from being in a large team. For me, I left an organization of thousands of people where I had friends in all corners of the globe that worked for that company, et cetera, et cetera. So, and whether it's in a virtual world on Zoom or whether it's in a physical office, you're meeting around the coffee machine, you're going for Friday night drinks, you've got a social outlet is also part of working in a larger company. How did you cope with this going from that kind of social network to being a solopreneur, and any advice to others that might be going through that right now?
I joined a business networking organization, which many people know about. It's BNI, which is a worldwide organization. And the minute I walked into and experienced the first meeting as a visitor, I thought, oh my God, this is a room full of people whose sole purpose being there is to help one another with their word of mouth marketing. How great is that? And not only did I join, I discovered that in addition to helping one another with word of mouth marketing, they were also informally providing a lot of the emotional support that we need as entrepreneurs to keep going. Because there's no question that being an entrepreneur is hard. It's way harder than being an employee. You need to set up your own structures. You need to continually be motivated. You need to deal with a lot of no's. As an employee, you're not going to hear that many no's. You're going to hear mostly yeses. As an entrepreneur, you mostly hear no's. So, emotionally, you have to be prepared for all that. And being around people whose primary function is marketing and sales. They're the business owners themselves, or in some cases, they're like a salesperson in a bigger company. It was great support. And I learned a lot about marketing and sales from them.
All right, BNI, that's a good recommendation. Any other networking event, but surrounding yourself with people that might be going through similar things that you're going through, which is a beautiful segue to talk about Smashing the Plateau. Now, I've got some interesting questions to ask here. So you've been in business for 16 years now. You've been a podcaster for 8 years, which for those that don't know the stats, by the way, most podcasts, the average length that a podcast goes is about 8 episodes, right? So now here's David, 8 years later, still doing a podcast and 16 years into a business as a consultant. And you've had great success, and congratulations on that. What inspired the more recent move to start Smashing the Plateau and also this community?
What I saw in my podcasting was a lot of my guests have been solo consultants, and many of them, like me, had a long career as an employee prior to starting their consulting business. I did a little bit of market research before starting the second podcast, Going Solo, and then starting the community. One of the things I learned in my market research is that many of these folks didn't leave their jobs voluntarily. They were pushed out, but they, like me, they wanted to be entrepreneurs. They didn't want to be part of the corporate culture anymore. And it's a challenging transition. And I know what helped me. I know that I didn't have a community of solo consultants that I could spend time with. If I had, I think my business would have grown faster. I think I would have made fewer mistakes. I would have had access to resources that took me a long time to find. And I did a little bit of market research on what I thought might be needed to help folks like this be more successful in their consulting businesses. And so we launched this community initially with a small number of founding members to kind of test it out and see how well it worked. And I have to say, I'm really touched by the camaraderie that has developed, by people's willingness to support one another. I kind of envision this as being a safe, caring place where you could come in and let your hair down a little bit and talk about what some of the issues are that you're challenged with. I know for many people, it takes a little bit of time before you feel comfortable doing that, especially if you're doing it in an online setting where you're not meeting people face to face. Even though we have a lot of live sessions, still it takes time for people to feel comfortable doing that. And I have to say that I've been kind of overwhelmed with the response, and that people are opening up, they're sharing, they're supporting one another. There have been some great new resources I've actually learned about from some of the members of the community that I wasn't aware of. And so, we're creating a resource library with all these things so that people have access to some of these things, have access to templates and guides that can be helpful if you're negotiating contracts or trying to create new pricing scenarios. These are all things that there are a lot of unknowns when you're doing them. And so if you can bounce these, what you're thinking about, bounce them off colleagues, it's really helpful. So I've been kind of, as I said, overwhelmed with what's happened so far. And I don't know of any other, I've been in this space for a while. I've been podcasting, interacting with people over these issues for a number of years. I don't know of another community quite like this one. There are other networking communities and business strategy communities. There are more of these kinds of resources for bigger companies, bigger and more established companies. Not as many, from what I've seen, that really focus on providing what consultants need from the very beginning of an idea of starting a consulting business to ones that have been established for quite some time, in particular with a particular emphasis on helping consultants deal with the emotional stress of going solo.
So I love that on so many levels, David. The first one is actually the market research bit. So what I'm hearing from you, I'll just put this out there. If people keep on coming to you and telling you the same story or asking you the same question, it's telling you that there's a market there. There's a gap that needs to be filled. So I like that you're paying attention to all these guests that were coming on your show and telling you a similar story, and for you to go, there's something in this. There's something needed here. And then the second part is then what you're providing. You're providing such great value to these people that are going through something in their life. They're going through an emotional time, but they're also having these, not just the emotional support, but this need for advice and guidance to accelerate them so that they can come out the other end of that emotional roller coaster faster and to get themselves set up and ready to go. And the third one is, I love that you're in there learning as well. So the power of community, it's not about who started the community. It's about everyone talking and contributing, because we've all got our own experiences. We've all had our own unique skill sets, our own unique experiences that we can bring to the table. And a powerful community is not when everyone listens, it's when everyone interacts. So,
yes, this is definitely not about me. Yes, I may have started it, and yes, I may facilitate what goes on, but the power of a community is actually what happens among the members.
Yeah.
That's why it's called community.
Brilliant. Okay. I'm going to ask you one side question that is offbeat from what we've discussed as our theme today, but it's always one that has made me curious. You've spent a lot of years in not-for-profits, David. Can you tell us what are the fundamental differences, if any, when you're leading someone who's a volunteer compared to someone who's a paid employee or a contractor or someone that's there because they're being fiscally rewarded? Does it change in any way?
Yeah, there's a big difference, actually, which is, and I spent the first 4 years of my career in the corporate world as an engineer. So I have experienced the differences between the corporate world and the not-for-profit world. Yeah, the big difference is, as when you're dealing with paid employees, you have some leverage as the manager over those employees, as the direct supervisor, because you're responsible for them getting paid and feeding their family. For a volunteer, you don't have any economic leverage whatsoever. In fact, you not only want the volunteer to do work, you want them to contribute money to the organization. So it's actually the reverse economic leverage. They have leverage over you because they're providing your paycheck.
Yeah, right.
But you have to get them to do work. So it's a very interesting dynamic. And if you can get a bunch of volunteers to perform well, then you can probably do really well with paid employees.
Yeah, really good. Okay, I like this. And the root of leadership, it's all about how you interact with other human beings, first of all, but it's about how you inspire people into meaningful action. And hopefully that meaningful action is around a worthy cause, right? And in this case, it feels like it's leadership in its purest, because they're not there because you're paying them. They're there because they believe in the cause. And now it's up to you to inspire them into meaningful action that helps the cause. So yeah, I really like that, David. That's very good. All right, so that brings us to a close. I'd like to go through our rapid fire round. So these are the same questions we ask all of our guests, David. So the first one is, what's the one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you were 20?
That multiple revenue streams are less risky than a single revenue stream.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And people talk about security, right? I picked that up when you were talking about it before. They think that working in our job gives job security, but that job security is not infinite and it's absolute. It becomes a dependence and it becomes binary, the binary nature that you said before, 100 to 0. Very good. All right, what's your favorite book?
I have so many. I really like The One Thing by Gary Keller.
That's come up a few times from a few guests, by the way. Very good. All right, what's your favorite quote?
Favorite quote? I'm not sure that I have this exactly right, but it's by Robert Frost. Road diverges in the wood, and I took the one less traveled.
And finally, I'm sure there's going to be people in the audience that are really intrigued by everything you've said, David, and particularly the Smashing the Plateau community. How do people get in contact with you if they'd like to know more?
Pretty simple. smashingtheplateau.com is the repository for both information about the community and all the podcasts, episodes, and any of the free content that we're putting out there. You can also subscribe to our email list by on the website. We send out 5 emails per week. They're about the podcast episodes, and most of them are about solving the kinds of problems that consultants face. They're usually pretty interesting. You can get in touch with me on LinkedIn, pretty easy to find. You can actually call a phone number in the US if you so desire and speak to a live human.
Wow, that's unusual. We don't do that so often anymore. Yeah, very good, David. Thank you so much for everything today. Thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom. Thank you on behalf of everything for the work that you do. It's really important. There are a lot of people that get to these forks in the road, and it is an emotional roller coaster when these changes happen. So thank you for all that you do and your community. And thanks again for your time on the show today.
No, thank you for having me, Mick.
Today's episode was brought to you by my new book, You're a Leader, Now What? The Proven Path to High Performance Leadership. The book contains many of the great lessons that we've learned together here on the Leadership Project podcast, together with lessons that I've collected over my 30-year career as a leader. The book is aimed towards first-time leaders, but really there's something in there for everyone. If you would like to show your appreciation for this show, we would greatly appreciate if you were able to go and get your copy of the book on Amazon as either an ebook or a paperback, and if you could leave us an honest review on Amazon. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Project podcast at mickspears.com. A big call out to Faris Sadek for his sound design and editing of our audio and video content, and to the whole team at TLP, Joanne Gozon, Gerald Calabo, Rika Vidanes, and my wonderful supportive wife, Say Spears, who is also our operations manager. This show would simply not be possible without you. If you've enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating and review at Apple Podcasts. You can catch the video podcast and our video of the week at the Leadership Project YouTube channel, and you can join the conversation at the Leadership Project Facebook community group. We look forward to bringing you more great content and interviews next week as we continue to learn together and lead together. In the meantime, please do take care, look out for each other, and always remember to challenge the status quo.